That's
Um,
good to hear.
Thank you to everyone who's joined us this evening. My name's John Pashia, and I'm here on behalf of the Eastern Missouri Beekeeping Association for our April meeting. And we have some announcements this evening, and then a little bit of information for the beginners, and a little information for the more experienced beekeepers who are in our group, talking about swarm traps and catching swarms. And so before we get into that, I think we should go over a few announcements. I received an email from a lady, and I can read some of this email. It's from a lady named Victoria, who is a master gardener, and she's the chairman for the Muds Grove Kirkwood Historical Society in Kirkwood, Missouri. And their group is looking for someone to talk about honeybees. And I've done this type of thing many times in the past, and it's always a lot of fun. They said that their lecture series is on the first Friday of the month at 12:30 p.m. And the months that they have open are May and August. So the first Friday in May and the first Friday in August are both open for someone if they want to speak about honeybees to a group of gardeners. I'm sure they're very interested in hearing about how honeybees, affect the ecosystem and how important they are as pollinators. So if someone is interested in giving a talk, I would encourage you to do that. If you're interested, feel free to send an email to info@easternmobeekeepers.com, and then I can pass on Victoria's email address, and that way you'll have it to get in touch with her. So that's the first thing on the agenda for tonight. The next thing, probably the next big upcoming event, is going to be the queen delivery. The queen delivery is scheduled for this coming Saturday, the 16th. And the pickup for the people who have purchased queens will be 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. this coming Saturday. Before I give more details on that, I saw something pop up on my screen, and so I wanted to make this announcement. So the meeting tonight is being recorded, and if you have a question, please put your question under the Q&A tab. And if you have a technical issue that you would need Michael, who's running this Zoom webinar, or someone else to address, if you can put that in the chat. So all questions, put that in the Q&A, any technical issues in the chat. So that's the housekeeping item taken care of. Back to the queens. So the queens that will be picked up this Saturday, April 16th, 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. at the Donald Danforth Plant Science Center off of Olive. And when you arrive in that hour, we're going to have a few people there. If anyone is interested in volunteering, volunteers are always appreciated. In the past, we've had people almost operate like a drive-through window, where especially with COVID issues and some of the volunteers that we have having compromised immune systems, they requested that anyone coming to pick up queens, if you can simply have the name and how many queens that you're there to pick up, and just have that on a piece of paper and just put it on your window, or you can hand it to somebody who comes up, and that way they know how many queens to get you. And they can give you the queens and then move on, and the next person can get served, so they can make this a fairly short and concise event. So it's important that everyone arrives on time so that the volunteers can distribute the queens, and then they can go and install their own queens or do whatever they need to do. If you're going to be there to get queens, I know that in my experience, when I go to get queens, the queens will be shipped in a large, what they call a battery box, and the battery box will have the individual queen cages, and then the queen cages, in order to keep them better fed and warmer, the supplier then dumps a bunch of loose bees on the outside of those queen cages and then seals the box that's ventilated. And so whenever the volunteers get there, they open that up and there'll be some bees flying around. And when I go to get queens, I prepare by having a box that is ventilated and has maybe a little container that might have some queen candy. And so I'll make powdered sugar and just a little bit of honey into a paste and have that in a little container inside this box. And then I'll take a folded up paper towel and put that in a Ziploc bag and open up the side of the Ziploc bag and put moisture so that there's water, there's food, and then my queen cages go inside that. And then I'm able to transport them. If the weather is poor, I know that those queens in those cages will have food and water, and any bees that are on the outside of those queen cages, it won't be an issue. Most of the time we can brush those queens cages free of the outside bees and it won't be an issue. But usually I don't mind having a few extra bees on the outside just to help take care of my queens until I can get them installed. So if you ordered queens and paid for queens and find that you no longer are needing those queens, we might have a few people on a waiting list that are looking for queens, and so we can either put you in touch with them or relay your information if you find that you no longer are looking for queens. Send an email again to info@easternmobeekeepers.com, and we'll try to put you in touch with people who are on the waiting list. So if you have questions about that, make sure, I'm looking at my screen here, trying to see if we have any Q&A. I don't see any yet, so we're okay. The next topic will be the nuke delivery. Now, the nuke delivery from the outset was scheduled for the 23rd of April or possibly the 30th of April. So at this point, I had been thinking it was the 23rd, and we're still waiting to hear from the supplier for sure to confirm that it is the 23rd, or it might be the 30th. I know they've had some bad weather down in the south. And so unfortunately, as much as I would love to give everyone a firmed up date, we're still waiting to hear from the supplier. And as soon as we have that confirmed date, we'll send out information to the people who have ordered nukes to make sure that they can be there to pick up their nukes. The nuke delivery date, whether it ends up being the 23rd or the 30th, both of those dates, when those nukes arrive, the club and specifically me, I will be there with some of the core volunteers that have helped year after year, but we are always desperately in need of volunteers to assist in the distribution and the screening up of the nukes. Each one of the nucleus colonies will be transported on the back of a trailer, and they're covered, the whole group is covered with a massive tarp. That tarp, or that kind of a ventilated tarp, has to be removed early in that morning. Usually the volunteers arrive around 5 a.m. And the goal is to get all 200 nucleus colonies, get the bees smoked back into the boxes and screen entrance reducers to be put into each of those nucleus colonies. Usually 6:30 to 8 a.m. is when the pickup times are. So that's usually the expected time. So again, we haven't heard for sure the 23rd or the 30th, But as soon as we find that out, we will be contacting everyone about that firmed up date. With me here, I've got, let me lean back and grab it. I've got, if you can see this is a piece of screen. These I had to, with the assistance of a fellow beekeeper named Dan, we cut out about 385 of these screens. And these have to be kind of creased right down lengthwise. And occasionally, depending on the manufacturer of the boxes these nucs come in, occasionally we have to use tin snips to trim these to make sure that they fit well. So this is an important part of this whole event, is making sure that these nucs are screened up and placed into position so that when 6:30 rolls around and the nuc purchasers have arrived, that we can load these up for people and make this a successful event. So again, as soon as we have a firmed up date, I'll pass that information. I'll pass that information on. As I'm looking here, I see we have a question: are nucs still available for purchase? And so, yes, the nucleus colonies, and I want to make sure to be as clear as I can, there are nucleus colonies still available. Our plan is to shut down the nuc sale at the end of this webinar. So, approximately 9 p.m. So if there's anyone in the club who's wanting to purchase nucs, you've got about an hour and 45 minutes to make that happen. So yes, indeed. The pickup location for the nucleus colonies is going to be the same parking lot as the Queens. The Donald Danforth Plant Science Center has been very generous in allowing us to use their large parking lot that's well lit for the last, half dozen years. And it works well. It's fairly centrally located, easy to get in, easy to get out, and has a large enough location that we can do events like this. So our plan is to be there for the Queen delivery this coming Saturday, 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. Again, if you can put your name and, my name's Joe Blow and I'm here for 6 queens or 4 queens, and then have that available so that people can quickly find your name on the list, get the queens and get them to you so you can be on your way. And I think, let's see here. I think that is what I have for my announcements. If there's any other questions, feel free to submit them. I'm looking at a text message as we speak from someone who may have information about the nucs. So it says here, John, I just sent you a text. I got off the phone with the supplier confirming loading the nucs Thursday evening, 4/21. This is the date he sent, I believe, based on original conversation with Bob. So I'll amend what I just said earlier. So the 23rd will be the delivery date. We thought it would be the 23rd or the 30th, but based on this text information from Dave, who originally had been, he's went down many times with Laura to pick up the nucs. He's been communicating with the supplier. So it looks like the 23rd is going to be the date. So April 23rd, the pickup times for the people who can't volunteer, 6:30 a.m. to 8 a.m. And the volunteers, if you're able to volunteer, bring your bee suit, bring a smoker, bring a pair of tin snips if you have them. And it's kind of a wild hour and a half, but it's an incredible event to participate in. If you've never been around a trailer load of bees, this is one of those opportunities that most beekeepers never get a chance to do. So I encourage everyone who can. Many hands make the workload a lot lighter. So please volunteer if you can. And once we're done screening in, if you've got nukes on order, then you can take your nukes and go ahead and head out. So that's all the questions I see about that. So we'll begin kind of the two presentations that I've got for this evening. The first one is going to be a little bit of a review for people who've ordered nukes on kind of what to expect, kind of have a checklist going on, and the list of things that you need to be aware of and things that need to happen before these bees arrive on the 23rd. So this is kind of what we're going to discuss. And then my second presentation will be more geared towards experienced beekeepers talking about swarms and catching swarms and using bait boxes for swarms. So Michael, if I can get your assistance here. This is my first time doing a presentation when someone else has control of the PowerPoint slides. So we're gonna give this a try and see what happens here. So purchasing your bees, hiving packages, hiving nukes. The club has purchased has recommended that you purchase nucleus colonies. That's what we've sold as a fundraiser for the club. But a lot of people might have purchased their bees through packages. And so I thought I would briefly kind of review kind of both of those steps. Michael, I'm not sure if it makes a difference, but down in the bottom, I don't see my face. I just see Steve Rudolph's, so or his screen. So if there's a way to change that, I'm not sure if there is or not. There we go. Now I can see myself. So the first slide, purchasing bees, hiving packages, and nukes. What can we expect, and what are the differences? Go ahead, Michael, to the next slide, if you will. So, we might know what a package looks like on the right, and what a nuke looks like. What are the differences? What can I expect? Normally packages arrive a little earlier than nukes, but with a nucleus colony, you have the advantage of having 5 drawn frames, an active queen that has already been accepted with the colony, and overall their development just seems to operate a little bit faster. Go ahead, Michael. So this is a slide that I've included, although I don't agree with a lot of what's on here. So I'll be brief about it. But this was, showing kind of a difference, a comparative difference between, what you would expect in a nuke, what you would expect in a package, and the bees in a nuke are usually a little bit later, like I said. I don't agree with something listed here where it says that nukes don't need to be fed. They should come with food stores. Most of the time, you're good. Go back. You can go to the next slide, Mike. Thank you. Most of the nukes, they do have some food, but if you want that nucleus colony to grow, you're going to need to supply some sugar syrup to get them to grow at a good rate. You have a lot of days occasionally where it's rainy, and because of that, having that food inside the colony where they can continue to build, even in poor weather, is something that I would encourage you to do, because it just helps the overall performance of your nucleus colony. So I've included here, the previous slide just had a picture of a bunch of the volunteers from years past who had nukes. we'd lay back in the day, we used to lay them out like this. And with COVID and with different issues, now we've decided to do it more of a drive-through, and it worked really well last year. I think it was last year, and it rained on us so bad, it was terrible. But we still were able to get everything distributed, and it worked out real well. So again, a good crew really makes the morning go by a lot faster. Okay, so on to the next slide. A pre-flight, what I would say, a pre-flight checklist. Things that you should have completed or need to get completed before you get your bees. The first one's kind of a joke, but having the support of your spouse or significant other is pretty handy to have before you get your bees. They need to be on board with this activity. An apiary location picked out and cleared of debris, cleared of tripping hazards, level. You want a good place to store and to house your hives. The hive stand, however you're going to create a hive stand, you need to have that made and in position and leveled. Usually the recommendation is that your hive tip ever so slightly, from the back to the front, so that any moisture, rain, condensation, if it lands inside the colony, that it will roll out the front. So whether you make your stand, level and put a shim on the back of the hive just to raise it up a little bit, that's usually what I do. But I encourage you to have your stand as level as possible. Your wooden equipment, this goes or should go without saying. You want your wooden equipment, your hive assembled, you want it painted, you want it stained, whatever you're going to do to protect it. You want that all accomplished. You want to give yourself, 2 hours is a little excessive, but you want to give yourself time in order to transfer the bees into the equipment. You don't want to feel rushed. You want to make sure that you've got time to get suited up and get your smoker lit and get the bees installed properly. Making up your 1-to-1 sugar syrup beforehand, so that it's cool. If you heat your water up to dissolve the sugar a little easier, you want to have your sugar syrup made up. 1-to-1 sugar syrup means 1 part water, 1 part sugar. So a gallon of hot water to 2 8 pounds of sugar, or 2 4-pound bags of sugar, or half a gallon of water to 1 bag, depending on how big your feeder is. And I would encourage people to practice lighting your smoker so that it doesn't go out, that it stays lit for a while. The more you can practice with that, the better off you're going to be. And then the last thing I've listed here is take off your rings if you can. The reason I mention that is because many people who become beekeepers haven't been stung in a long time. And so they don't really know how their body is going to react. And if you get stung on your fingers or on your hand or on your wrist, there's a high probability that your fingers are going to swell, that your wrist is going to swell. And so I encourage you that if you can slide your rings off until you get a better feel for how your body is going to respond, it's probably a better plan than having to have, puffy fingers and, having to cut one of your rings off your finger because your fingers have swelled up because you might have gotten stung. So I just mentioned that because a lot of people don't think about that kind of thing. Okay, Michael, your next slide. Okay, come prepared and come early. So before you come pick up your nukes or your queens, it's probably not a bad idea, if you've purchased queens or purchased nukes, to have a copy of your receipt with you, just in case there's a discrepancy, just in case you show something different than what we show on our list. We haven't had issues in the past, but it would just, to me, would be a good idea to have that with you. You'd want to have a vehicle that's equipped and prepared to haul the nuke or nucleus colonies that you've ordered. You know, depending on what you're bringing, what you're driving, having straps, having something to keep the nuke from sliding around. If you know what a single deep hive body looks like, well, a nucleus colony is going to be half that wide. So that gives you a general idea. I've seen people who haven't given that much consideration and have put nucleus colonies in the back of a pickup truck, planning to just take off onto the highway without considering, what if I have to stop quickly? What if I have to turn quickly? Is the nuke secured in the back and won't roll or flip if I make a turn? So keep that in mind. And the nucleus colony should be your main purpose for showing up there. So make sure the vehicle has room to accept a nucleus colony. I mention that because I can't tell you how many times I went to assist someone in putting a nucleus colony in the back of their vehicle, and it looks like they were getting ready to go on vacation, and the back of the vehicle is just crammed with stuff, and there's nowhere to put it, and they've got to drag half of the back of their vehicle out onto the parking lot so they've got room to put the nucleus colony. So again, for time and efficiency, try to make sure your vehicle is equipped to come pick up the nukes. Bring your bee suit. You'll feel more comfortable having your bee suit on, especially if the bees are going to be in the vehicle with you, in the back seat, strapped into the back seat, or in the cargo area of an SUV. You may feel a little awkward driving with your veil on, but if a bee or two happens to be flying around, you'll feel better knowing that you're safe and nothing's going to happen, especially when you're headed down the road, driving your vehicle. Please arrive on time. Again, this is something that for the volunteers who have been there, since 5, or I'll probably be there about 4:30. They will already have had a long morning. So please arrive on time so that we can distribute all the nucleus colonies, and then everyone can go on their way, doing what they need to do that Saturday. What about bad weather? What if the weather is bad? What if it's raining? What if it's too cold? It's always unpredictable, the weather. So if you get your nucleus colony picked up and it's too cold or it's raining, what I encourage you to do is to take it home or take it to your bee yard and to place it on top of your colony. So your equipment sitting on your hive stand, you can set it immediately to the side of it or on top of your hive that's sitting on the hive stand. And at a minimum, you have to pull the screen, the entrance screen that we will have placed there to keep the bees inside the box. If it's cold, there may not be much activity of the bees flying out, but you need to make sure that they can fly if they need to cool the colony or to go on cleansing flights once the weather improves. That's at a minimum. And then if the weather is nice, which I hope that it is, you can install your nucleus colonies right then. You can wait a couple hours and do it. It really is just determined by your own schedule. And then keep in mind that your nucleus colony is perishable. You need to keep it cool, and you need to get to your bee yard. So you don't want to pick it up and have it in the back of your vehicle as you go into Bob Evans and sit down for a breakfast while the vehicle's sitting in the sun. These are the kind of things that, again, we've seen before. We're encouraging you to have everything ready to go and head straight to the bee yard so that the bees can be put safely into the bee yard and then installed. So, okay, Michael, I think we're ready for the next slide. We've spoken before about what makes a good apiary. The hive stand on the right with the 2 hives, is set up pretty decently. The screen here says you need space behind your hives to perform inspections, which is true, but I usually work my colonies from the side. It's just easier on my back to work it from the side. If you look at the hives that are on that long hive stand to the left, to me, people might be able to make that work, but it looks to me to be way too crowded, too awkward to work. I like having 2 hives and then a space and then 2 more hives and a space so that you can get on both sides relatively easy. And then the bottom picture in this presentation shows, you know, that back area, if you owned a large piece of property, might be okay, but you might want it a little closer when it comes time to maintain or to take care of your colony. That might be a little easier if it's a little closer. Okay, Michael, go ahead. Okay, some people, you know, I would have thought the majority of you who were listening to this have already planned on purchasing a nuke, or you've already got your nuke and your package, and you've already got your bees taken care of. But I've had people ask me, can I just wait? Can I just set the empty hive out on my hive stand and hope that a swarm moves in? And I tell them, you know, you can. It's probably unlikely that that's going to happen, but you could definitely try that. But trying to catch a swarm or waiting for a swarm to move into your equipment, you know, is very unpredictable. You might get lucky, but we're going to talk in the next presentation about kind of how to improve your luck and what bees are looking for in a swarm box. And so we'll discuss that in just a little bit. Okay, to the next one, Michael. Okay, so we're going to go through this quickly because, again, most of the people I think here will probably have purchased a nuke, and many of you may not have had a package of honeybees ordered, or may have already received your honeybees if you ordered a package. But this is what a package looks like. There's a can that has sugar syrup. There's a queen that's suspended inside the cage, and there's, you know, usually about 3 pounds of bees that are floating inside there, with surrounding the queen, kind of hanging or festooning on each other, just kind of a big glob of bees. Okay, next slide, Mike. Okay, so usually what I recommend is that you have some sugar syrup in a spray bottle. That works really well. And usually what I'll do is I'll douse the bees, spraying them on both sides and coating the bees, you know, quite a bit. Try to get, you know, quite a bit of that sugar syrup. They love it. And what it does is it really helps minimize the flying around of the bees when you open the box. And so I spray it with some sugar water. Again, my equipment is set out, ready to go. Okay, next slide, Mike. And you pop off the wooden piece, wooden cover that keeps the jar, the metal can of syrup in, keeps the queen cage positioned properly. You pry that off, and then you pull that can up with your hive tool. And as soon as you pull that can up, you know, there are bees inside the box, and they're going to want to fly out or start crawling out. So I usually have that piece of wood handy, and I'll pull out the can of syrup. And then when the can of syrup is removed, usually you then have access to slide out the queen cage. And when I get the queen out, I want to take a minute to examine to make sure she's healthy. And so I put that little piece of wood back over the hole that the can had been underneath. Okay, next slide, Michael. So you slide the can out, you reposition, you pull the queen cage out, you reposition that piece of wood back over the hole to keep the bees inside. And then you want to examine to make sure the queen is healthy and in good shape. Next slide. So yeah, that shows it a little better. You don't want to drop her into that 3-pound mess of bees, because then it becomes a lot more difficult. You know, there are going to be bees all over that cage. And if you pull it out, you're in good shape. If you drop it, it's going to fall into that big ball of bees, and you're going to have a little harder time, you know, getting it out. So you pull the queen cage off. If there are bees all over the cage, then I would lean over to where my hive is and just shake it once or twice, and a lot of those bees will fall off. Next slide. And then you'll be able to take a look at the queen to make sure she's moving around. And as you can see in this picture, the queen cage has the queen cage on the right picture. You see there's three circular sections to this queen cage. This is called a Benton cage. And some queen cages are JZ, BZ cages and look different than this. But there's a candied end with the white kind of icing candy on one end, and there's a cork, and the other end has got a cork also if you want to directly release her. So I always tell people you want to pull the cork on the candied end and position that queen cage in the center of the box between two frames so that the bees have access to that screened side that you can see there. That's important that they are able to communicate with the queen, feed her, pick up her pheromones, and distribute those pheromones into the remaining bees in the colony, therefore increasing her acceptance, her acceptance into the colony. The reason that she is kept separate is because she is a queen, but she is not their queen. Those bees came from a different hive than that queen did. And so they have to accept her, and that cage is there to protect her and keep her safe until they do. Okay, next slide. So that's showing pulling the cork out of the candied end. Sometimes a pocket knife, sometimes, you know, the edge of your hive tool, whatever it takes. A little screwdriver works well. You want to open that up, and I like to position it where the candied end is facing up. And I've heard arguments going both directions. Some people say if it's really hot, the candy could get soft and could drip down on the bees, and that could hurt the queen. And so they recommend that you put the candy end down. I've always been a believer of if one of the attendants that are inside the queen cage, so you have a queen and 3 to 5 workers are in there with her to take care of her, and those workers are called attendants. And the attendants, if one of those dies, gravity is going to cause her to fall down to the bottom. And if you've got the candied exit on the bottom, well, that she could block the exit of the queen once they've made their way through that candy. She has a harder time getting out. And so that's the reason I tend to do it candied in facing up. Next slide, Michael. So you want to position her between 2 of the frames and where the bees can feed her and take care of her, usually towards the top. And once you've done that, then it's time to add the remainder of the bees. And so next slide should show you spraying the package again with some more sugar syrup, coating those bees, giving them carbohydrates at the same time as dampening their wings with the sugar syrup, distracting them so they want to lick up all that good syrup, and it makes them easier to dump into the hive body. So usually what I do is spray them and then thump the box on the ground, and all the bees that are all inside the box go straight to the bottom of the box, and then I can move the wood carefully and then start shaking the bees into and on top of the queen so that they know where she's at. That should be covered on the next slide, I believe. So dumping them in, and then once you've done that, then it's just a matter of replacing the remaining frames that will fit. Sometimes the queen cage, depending on how you install it, might not allow you to put all your frames back, but you want to put as many as will fit. All right, next slide. 10 might not fit with the cage. And so as you can see there's bees all over the box. They're all over the perimeter of the box. If you go to put your inner cover and your feeder on, you're going to possibly smash some bees there. So your smoker will be very efficient at making the bees move so that you can place your inner cover on, put your feeder, if you are using a bucket or a gravity feeder, putting that on top of the hive. You don't want to smash any more bees than you have to. So make sure the bees are as many as will get out of your way as you possibly can. And the next slide just deals with feeding. What should you feed? How should you feed? When should you stop feeding? These are questions that I see all the time. And so usually what I recommend is that if you're using a package or if you're using a nucleus colony, both kind of fall under the same rules or guidelines when it comes to feeding. I like to feed my bees until they are working on 8 or 9 frames in the lower box. And then I add the next box on top. I usually operate 2 deep boxes for my brood nest. And so the bees will continue to build, and then I add my second box. I continue to feed until they're finished or are working actively on 8 or 9 frames in the top box. Bees tend to want to disregard frame 1 and frame 10, or if you're using 9 frames 1 and 9. The outside frames, they usually are resistant to wanting to work on those. And so when they start working in the upper box, once they start working on a couple of frames, I will often take any frames in the lower box that they have refused to work on and swap those with frames that they have worked on. Your goal your first year is to have your hive equipped to survive winter. You might get honey, you might not, but that's the goal. The goal is to get them ready for winter, and the bees need comb to store honey. They need comb to raise their young, to store pollen. And if you have frames in your box that are not drawn out, that's less space that they have to store what they need to store. And so I try to make sure that they're being fed. They may slow down in taking the syrup, but I'm okay with that. I figure if as long as I've provided it, they can take what they want. And I've done everything in my power to make sure that they are moving along at the pace that I hope that they will. So I cease feeding. I take the feeders off when the bottom box is drawn out, and the top box they're working on 8 or 9 frames. I then feel that they're strong enough and ready enough, probably for a super, and I won't be feeding when there's a honey super on the colony. I don't want the bees to take the syrup that I've given them and build and store that in a honey super, because that's not honey, and a honey super is for storing honey. So by then their population should be large enough and they should be strong enough to fend for themselves, to bring in nectar if there's a nectar flow going on, and to make sure that they're storing honey in those boxes. And from that point moving forward, you cross your fingers and hope that there's still time in the schedule for you to get, a good honey harvest. Let's see here. Okay, so next slide, Michael. So now that they're inside, I always tell people, pat yourself on the back. Most people get very anxious about installing nukes or installing packages. And once they've done it, usually the feedback I get is that it wasn't as terrifying as they thought it was going to be. It was actually pretty quick, pretty easy. So, I tend to feel that you should check on your bees, once a week. You want to see how they're doing. You need to make sure to refill the feeder if it needs it. You want to see how quickly they are developing, how quickly or what progress they've made. So yeah, I usually tell people, once a week, once every 10 days is probably not a bad idea when they're just building their colony. An inspection will often set a colony back for a day. When you go in and start rifling through things and use smoke and all that, it's essential that you understand what's going on in your colony. But from a bee's perspective, they probably need some time to recover and bounce back from that. And so it's probably not smart to be in there every 3 or 4 days, but once a week, once every 10 days, is probably a good time frame in order to go and check your bees. Refill your feeder when you do your inspections. Have some sugar syrup with you in a bucket and refill your feeder as necessary. Your entrance reducers, most of the time when a colony is drawn out and built into a single deep, usually it's warm enough and they're organized enough that you can remove their entrance reducer altogether, or at least have it on the larger opening if you don't feel confident. Usually the population is large enough that it's not an issue, in my experience. And we've already talked about when to put on the second box. When they're working on 8 or 9 frames, it's time for the next box. Okay, next slide, Michael. Okay, installing a nuke in a beehive. I don't have as many slides about this. I just couldn't find some slides that I really wanted to use. And so the one that I have, the next slide, it's probably best used to show how I install nukes. If you'll go to that next slide, Michael. So as you can see here, the installation process, or the installing process, here's someone with a nucleus colony, and right next to the nucleus colony, they have their full-size 10-frame box. And the nucleus colonies that you have, when you're carrying them, it's important that you carry them from the bottom to your hive stand, because the lids might not be as secured in such a way that you can carry them. I always recommend you lift it from the bottom, you take it out to your bee yard and set it right next to on the hive stand, or in this situation where he's installing it, you just set it, as close as you can to the 10-frame box and begin the process. So you'd have your suit on, you would have your smoker lit, and because you're dealing with a colony, not a package, you're dealing with a colony of bees, it's important a little smoke goes in the entrance of the colony to let the bees know, just like on a mature colony, to let the bees know, hey, we're coming in. And the lids on these nukes, sometimes they secure them with screws. Sometimes in the past, they've used like a crown stapler, which shoots a long staple into the box. So you're going to have your hive tool with you. And the hive tool, if it's staples, you might need to pry off the lid in order to get access to the nuke and the frames. And so usually what I recommend is, especially when you're prying or opening up a lid, you've got a lot of bees in this box. And when you open the lid, if you are prying up on it, any progress that you've made by prying or lifting, use your other hand to keep that consistent. So when you lift up, don't lift up and then push back down again, because the bees are going to be filling that space and you'll smash bees. So when I lift and pry, I'm applying a little tension upwards as I pry around the box so that the lid comes off and that I'm not killing bees or smashing bees trying to get the lid off. I'm not sure if the people at home can see me. I still see Steve Rudolph's name in the lower corner there. But that might only be my computer. I can't tell. I see Steve now. But the process should start with some smoke at the entrance, some smoke under the lid. Once you've taken off the lid, you would want to remove, you've got 5 frames to install. You're going to remove, let's say 6 or 7 frames to give yourself plenty of space, plenty of room. And what I usually tell people to do is have your smoker ready, have your hive tool in your other hand, and you're going to pry with your hive tool. You're going to twist the frames to separate frames 1 and 2 with just a little bit of space. And then you're going to want to pry up that frame, and with your fingers, lift up the frame. And usually frames on the outside will be food frames, frames with resources, honey, pollen, primarily, usually that's what that is. And the chances the queen is on that frame is pretty slim, but she could be. You want to always treat every frame like the queen is on that frame. And so that's going to be your first opportunity to see your bees. And so again, you've already put a puff of smoke or two across the top of the frames. That should make the bees move down, and you can lift out the first frame, looking at both sides of the frame, see if you can identify honey, see if you can identify brood or pollen, and you place or position that frame into the empty box or towards the middle. And you basically do that with each frame, each of the 5 frames, transferring them in order into the box. And then the remaining frames you would put back into your box so that the nucleus colony is positioned in the center of your 10 frame box. You want to push your frames together so that you have the equal amount of space on the left as the right, so that between your first frame and your 9th or 10th frame and the walls of the box, that there's space there for the bees to come back and forth and to work. That's important. And then you would put on your inner cover, and depending on what kind of a feeder you're using, if you're using a division board feeder that takes place of a frame or 2, well, then you would put that in and fill it up with syrup. If you're using a gravity feeder, you would put that on top of your inner cover, upside down once you've got a vacuum built, and you would want to put a rim, an empty deep or 2 empty mediums around that, and put your outer cover on top of that. And so, in the past couple months, we've had Anna Heck gave a demonstration on installing a nuke, and I did it before that. And so again, this is just a review. You're going to have some bees left over in your nuke box. Not all the bees are going to be on the frames. And so usually what I recommend is just leave that box out there next to the 10 frame equipment. And those bees will slowly but surely make their way out of the nuke box and into your 10 frame equipment, where the rest of the group is. They'll join them pretty quickly. So I'm not sure if we have any questions. I see one here. Let me see here. Okay, it says here, after my nuke has created 8 or 9 deep frames, can I put a medium on for some honey? I will stop feeding. After removing the medium, I will install a second deep and feed throughout the summer and fall. So that is that's a question. It's a good question. So I will say this, that when I personally catch a swarm of bees, I want to get something out of them from the year. I want them to build their home, but I also want to get some honey from them. And so what I do is allow them to build into a single deep, build their 8 or 9 frames in a single deep. And then I put a queen excluder on them and put a super on them or 2 in order to hopefully get some honey from them. In St. Louis, in this area, in Missouri, you can very easily overwinter a colony in a single deep. I do it all the time. The only problem I see with your process is that after the honey flow has ended, things tend to get very dry in St. Louis. Around 4th of July, mid-July, things really dry up. And if your goal is to get them to build a second deep, even when feeding, sometimes the bees have lost that desire to continue to build comb, and you might find them reluctant to want to build more comb after the honey flow has ended. And so, yes, you can allow them to build into a single deep. You can try to get honey from them. You know, I would say that you'd want to make sure that you're doing inspections to not have the colony crowded where they might want to think about trying to swarm. You know, that's always a concern when you limit the space that a colony has to develop. So that's just something to keep in mind. The idea of trying to get some honey from a colony and building them up into a single deep instead of a double deep, yes, that's very feasible. Yes, you can do it, but you know, so much of beekeeping is a give and take. Yes, you can get some honey from them, but you also have to be a little more concerned about possible swarming issues. You know, your first year, it all depends on the colony itself. But again, your goal your first year is to get them ready for winter. So don't be surprised that if after the season kind of comes to an end, that they're very reluctant to build that second deep. So keep that in mind. I've also used deeps in the past for supers, putting a queen excluder, letting them draw that out nicely during a honey flow, extracting the honey, and then giving them back the comb, either later that season or the following season when I need comb, when I'm making splits or making up nucleus colonies. Having drawn deep frames is pretty handy. Again, if that's your plan or your goal, you're going to have an extractor that would extract honey from a deep. Not all honey extractors will accept a deep frame, so keep that in mind. Another question: I will place my nuke box next to the new hive and open the entrance and immediately leave. I will come back an hour later. The video said the bees will be less upset and then install the nuke. Is this a good idea? You certainly can do that. The bees will be jostled around, you know, by the volunteers who are screening them in. They've been on the highway the day before. They've been bounced around up the highway, you know, all night. And if you are using, if the bees are close and your bee yard is in your backyard, yes, that's not a problem. If you have to drive, you know, 30 minutes to get to your bee yard, I would tend to install them immediately, just for convenience, just so that I don't have to wait around or come back later. They will settle down some, you know, when they get a chance to sit there for a little bit. So if you've got an hour to wait and it's not going to be an inconvenience, sure, wait a little while, let the bees fly some, and then go about doing your install. Let's see here. Okay, I've got another question here from Laura. Do you have to use foundation in the brood box frames, or is it okay to let the bees build it? So her question has more to do with, can you use, do you have to use foundation, or can you go foundationless? You can go foundationless. You know, in a lot of beekeepers are doing that. I just think that you need to be mindful and keep an eye on how they're building those frames to make sure they're building them properly. The foundation, just like a home builder, if you have a foundation there, they have a pretty good idea of where the house goes. The house goes on that foundation. If you don't give them a foundation, there's probably a larger opportunity for the bees to go freestyle with their building. So there are ways that you can help encourage the bees to stay on track and to stay drawing the frames out properly. That just becomes a little more of a challenge. So yes, you can go foundationless. You just need to keep an eye on them to make sure that they don't take off on a different angle than you want the comb to be drawn properly. So just something to keep in mind. Should I put a barrier in the way of limbs and such to give the opportunity to orient to the new location? No, that's not necessary. The bees will figure out very quickly where the queen is at. And so when you transfer those 5 frames into the box, the queen is going to be on one of those frames, and the bees in that colony will be on the landing board or the entrance, and they'll be fanning in an effort to send kind of a homing signal to say, hey, here's where we're at, everybody. There was a lot of disruption. There was this human, and he or she came in and took us out of the small box and put us in the big box, but here's where we're at. And they'll fan at the entrance, showing their Nasonoff gland, and that will help direct all the other bees who are disoriented to where they need to go. So you don't have to get them to reorient. They are already unfamiliar with anything in your area. They were in Louisiana, and now they're in St. Louis, so they're totally unfamiliar with any of the landmarks, so it won't be a problem. Where can I see the video that we're taking right now? It's my understanding, and Michael or someone can correct me if I'm incorrect, but I believe that the recording will be uploaded or put on our EMBA, or Eastern Missouri Beekeeping Association's YouTube channel. That's usually where they go, as far as I know. I've never been involved in that part of the technical side of things, but that's where I believe it'll go eventually. I'm not sure when, but I'm hoping relatively soon. Part 2 of a question here. When installing a second deep, I will have built comb frames and better comb. The bees love better comb and will complete building very quickly. Okay, so there are several products that are relatively new that there's fully drawn comb that you can buy. And so, yes, I mean, if you have access to that, that's just going to speed the whole process up. It instantly gives, the queen somewhere to lay. It instantly gives them somewhere to store food and resources. And so, yes, no doubt, whether it's drawn comb from a previous dead out or another colony, or the stuff you purchased, the better comb, either way, that just helps speed the whole process up. So, okay, I think that is all the questions I see for right this second. So I will go to the next presentation, which is probably directed more towards, let's see here. If I can get my fingers to, so before I do that, I see Janet has a question here. During my spring inspection, I found one deep frame fully drawn with comb in my hive box. At the edge of the deep hive box, it had a blue-green cast on the sides of the cell, guessing due to moisture. This fungus or mold was on the side of the box too. I replaced the box with another clean one. Is it okay to leave this frame for the bees to clean? You hate to waste a fully drawn frame of comb. And so I'm going to answer this based off of my expectation that yes, it probably was, something to do with maybe some mold or mildew. Yes, the bees will clean that up. There's probably not going to be any issues at all. I have put, I'm not proud to say this, but I have put some rather nasty combs in hives before, just to test to see what the bees will do. And it's remarkable how much they can clean up and repair damaged combs. So yes, I don't think you'll have any issues. The other box that you took off, I would say with if it is something like a mold, I would think that washing it with a hose and something like that, and then letting it dry real well in the sunlight, probably will take care of that problem. Okay. So on to the next topic, and this is going to be more topical for the beekeepers who had their colonies already. To me, your second year and every year after that, it's more challenging because mature colonies that come out of spring or come out of winter into spring, there's a likelihood that if they're healthy, they're going to want to swarm. That's just kind of what bees do. There are things you can do to minimize or to lessen their desire to swarm, but I've never found anything that definitely 100% of the time keeps them from swarming. I think it's just part of keeping bees and part of keeping strong colonies that will get you a good honey harvest, which is my goal. I think that is just swarming is just part of the work and the attention to the bees that you have to deal with in the springtime. Michael, if you'll go to the next slide there. So if you'd like to learn more about swarming behavior, some of the questions here, I should have listed questions I may answer. I should have written on here questions that are addressed in a fantastic book that is called Honeybee Democracy. I've got a slide later on in this presentation, but it's a fantastic book about swarming behavior, and it really helps cover and answer a lot of questions that you have, even questions you never thought about why bees swarm, how the colony disbands, how far they go, what are colonies looking for in a new home. There's been a lot of research into that, and so it's a great read, and I encourage everyone who hasn't read it to pick that book up and to give it a read. I found it very fascinating. Then I've got a picture there of a swarm that I caught. My gosh, it's 12 years ago. I put on there about 3 p.m. That's when I found that swarm up in the tree. All right, so on to the next slide, Michael. So what is a swarm, and will you be ready? So a swarm is how a colony reproduces itself on the colony level. As a beekeeper, this is what I spend a majority of my time in the springtime trying to prevent. My colonies, I keep my colonies for honey production, and a colony naturally wants to swarm or to split into two. And the visual indicators that that a beekeeper should notice when they do inspections would be a large population. They would see, a colony that's really taking off, and queen cups, and later queen cells that are being built are all signs that a colony is not toying with the idea, but is set on trying to swarm. And so it's important that you take action to reduce their congestion before this happens, But once you see swarm cells, you can be very confident that that colony is going to try to swarm on you. And so if you don't take action, they will. Most of the time, people get busy in the springtime and they don't do inspections on a regular basis. When I say regular basis, I like to do my inspections every 7 days on overwintered mature colonies that are in danger of swarming. I'm in my colonies every 7 days to prevent this. And what I'm looking for are signs they're trying to swarm. The queen cell is for sure the biggest sign that I'll see. And I always try to tell people, in the springtime, you need to be prepared. That's the old Boy Scout slogan, always be prepared. So I always caution people, if you went out to your bee yard tomorrow and you found that your hive had swarmed, would you be ready for that? Would you have a plan in place? Do you have an extra hive body, an extra bottom board, an extra feeder, one that's not being utilized right now that you'd be able to dedicate to a swarm if you were able to catch one? If someone called you and said, hey, there's a swarm of bees over here in my neighbor's driveway, would you be able to go get it? Would you feel comfortable enough getting it? And what would you do with it once you got on the scene? So these are the things that I always tell people to be putting some thought towards, especially when swarm season is upon us. There was a beekeeper who sadly has passed away named Grant Gillard, and he was a fantastic beekeeper and a wonderful presenter. And he always said, proper planning prevents poor performance. So having a plan in place really helps you feel more confident that if something happens, you'll be able to address it. Some people like to put out swarm bait boxes in an effort to catch swarms kind of passively, where you're not having to actively go out looking for swarms that hopefully, that they will, if a colony swarms, that they might go into your box. If you check these boxes periodically, that you might be able to, catch a swarm, which is basically a free colony of bees for you. Next slide, Michael. So here's a couple pictures of some different takes on what a swarm bait box would look like. They do produce these commercially. Some people like to build their own out of scrap materials. The one in the lower right corner is made out of kind of like the paper pulp kind of a design. And I'm not a big fan of that. To me, a colony, if it moves into my bait box, I would love it if they loved my box and decided we're going to build in this location. This is awesome. If they were building on frames that I had in my box, well, that's just an added bonus. Now I don't have to remove that comb. And so I would prefer that any efforts that they made would be put towards benefiting the colony and building on foundation or building in comb that I put in that box. Just makes the whole process a little better. And so I like bait boxes that have the ability to house frames that I can then remove and put into my full-size equipment. So that's why I like the other three designs personally a little better. And so you can see they're strapped up into trees, and usually they have an entrance that you're able to close, so that if you find that you've captured a swarm, that you can just close the entrance, unstrap it, carefully carry it down a ladder or something like that, and then you can introduce it into your apiary. All right, next slide, Michael. So this is that book I was telling you about by Tom Seeley. Fantastic book, well worth the read. And the Cliff Notes version of this book, some of the highlights, I guess you would say. What are bees looking for? So Tom Seeley and his crew of researchers, they basically went out on an island and had a few colonies of honeybees and put out different size boxes, different heights, different entrance sizes, different volumes of the cavity, and in an effort to try to determine what are bees looking for, what's ideal or optimal. And so they found that a 40-liter cavity was the most preferred size for a swarm. And in the notes here, you can see when you compare what the volume of a 5-frame nuke versus a single medium or a single deep, that if 40 liters is optimal, the closest thing to that is a single deep. That's not to say that you can't catch one in a single medium or that you couldn't catch one in a 5-frame nuke. It's just that's not what the research shows is the most optimal size. You're going to want to place these away from other hives. I always tell people, you're going to want to put them a football field away if you could. Now, not everyone's yard or property would allow that to take place. And so put them as far away as you can so that if your hive swarms, the chances are they're not going to go 10 feet and take up a new residence. That's just not the way bees operate. They want to travel a distance to get to their new colony. And so if you're going to be putting a bait hive out or a bait box, you're going to want to put it, I don't have specific numbers, but you're going to want to put it 100 yards away, maybe further than that, if you're looking to catch swarms that might, leave your personal hives. 5 feet to 20 feet off the ground was what he tested. 15 feet high was optimal. So that might be what the bees prefer, but from a safety standpoint, I personally wouldn't want to be trying to climb, 15 feet high into a tree and trying to unstrap, a hive box and try to carry it down a ladder safely. And so at some point, common sense has to come into play, and you have to be careful on how you approach things. A 2-inch wide entrance, 2 square inch entrance actually, is what was preferred. And research shows that most swarms will cast off or leave the parent colony between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. And if the swarm lands on a surface or on a limb, if they're still there by 5 p.m., chances are they're going to remain there overnight. I always tell people, if I'm going to capture a swarm and it's 4:30, 5 o'clock, and they're still there when I get off work, that I don't feel as rushed. The chances are that they're going to remain there, and I can hopefully get them before it gets dark and get them into my equipment. Okay, next slide, Michael. Inside your bait box, if you're interested in doing these, they make commercially available lures. Swarm Commander is the name of one of them. Some people like to use just lemongrass oil. They make little vials that are slowly, kind of over time, they disperse the smell of lemongrass oil. And that seems to be a pretty reliable lure for capturing and enticing bees into your box. Coating the inside of your box with some propolis. Again, making that box smell like a beehive, what the bees are familiar with, is kind of important. Incorporating a piece of old brood comb, again, acts as an attractant. You want a box that's waterproof, on the roof, easy to transport and carry, and one that has an entrance that you can close up so that when you transport the hive, they can still be ventilated, but you can still transport them without the bees flying out. Okay, next slide. All right, so in my experience, strong colonies are much more prone to swarm. Weak colonies, not so much, but I've had weak colonies that are trying to swarm. That's just one of those genetic kind of hardwired impulses that colonies want to do. They want to reproduce. So these are just some pictures of some of my hives over the last couple of years. You know, the one on the right-hand side there was a major honey producer that year. And you can see in that picture that the top box in that tall colony, that's a deep, you know, so I was using supers, and it just turned out that I decided to use a deep on the top there to get drawn deep frames of foundation, or of a comb, I'm sorry, deep drawn frames of comb. But when you're lifting boxes that are, you know, 75 pounds that are that high, it does tend to strain the back. So that's something you have to keep in mind. So if your colonies are not doing well, or they're not growing, you know, is health an issue? That's always a concern. You know, are my hives healthy? Do I have a queen issue? Do I have some other kind of problem? Why aren't they growing? When you're comparing colony to colony, you know, what's causing my colonies to develop at different rates? It could be just their genetics. It could be a health issue. Could be a queen issue. That's where having multiple colonies really comes into play, where you get a chance to compare and contrast the development of your bees. Okay, and your next slide, Michael. So your hive is swarmed, now what? You know, if you have multiple colonies, which one of your hives swarmed? How do you know? And what do I do about after swarms? And so in my own bee yard, I try to be as responsible of a beekeeper as I can be. I've got neighbors surrounding the location that my hives are in. And so I want to make sure that there's not swarms that are causing problems for other neighbors. And so I try to make sure to always be on top of my maintenance and my inspections. But occasionally I'll miss a swarm cell when I go in to do inspections. I'll miss removing swarm cells, and a colony will swarm. And so usually the first thing I do when I know that they've swarmed is, and this is something that the hour following a swarm, if you had 10 colonies in a row and you find a swarm in your on a tree, if you go out and look at the front of your hives, compare the activity from one hive to the next and see if there's a hive that looks different. Which one of these looks a little different in their activity? Are they busier? Do they look less organized? Is there a lot of fanning out front to spread pheromones? If there are, that's usually an indication that that's the hive that swarmed. And if your colony, if you haven't been doing your inspections, the chances are that your colony will be producing more than one queen cell. And so some people assume that when a colony produces 10 queens, that as soon as those queen cells are capped, that the original queen will depart with the swarm, and the first queen that emerges will be the one who's going to be the new leader. And sometimes that happens, and sometimes she'll go around and kill her rivals, but sometimes you'll have what they call an after swarm, which is a smaller swarm because the population has been reduced when the initial swarm departed. You'll have an after swarm of a colony, which is usually led by a virgin queen. She emerges and they depart in a much smaller swarm. You can get a colony that will do that repeatedly, and a lot of times that will cause an issue with the colony just depleting themselves, casting off multiple swarms. And so when I find that I've got a colony that is swarmed, because I'm doing maintenance on a regular basis, what I'll do is go into the colony, find just one or two nice queen cells and remove the remainder of those queen cells. Now, some people will recommend you leave 2. in the past, I usually will leave one. I'll pick the nicest queen cell and leave it and remove the remaining cells. And what I've done is, I put all my eggs into one basket. So I'm really hoping that that big fat queen cell is active and viable, and that she will emerge, and that she'll go on her mating flights and return safely. If that happens, then there are no remaining queen cells in the colony, so they can't have after swarms. She's just going to be the new leader, and the colony over 4 or 5 weeks will eventually requeen themselves, and she'll be the new leader. And so that's what an after swarm is. And if you decide to take no action, the colony will probably requeen themselves fine, but there's always the risk of having after swarms that further deplete the colony and further reduce the chances of you getting a honey flow or a honey harvest from that colony this year. So that's something to consider. Some of these slides are just pictures of just different swarms that I've captured, or that I thought were pretty cool pictures. All right, the next slide, Michael. What happens if you don't collect the swarm? Especially in the more urban areas, swarming can become a nuisance for people who have structures and buildings and homes. And usually every year we get multiple phone calls about bees inside of walls, bees in my my roof, or in my under my siding, and they're in the walls. And that becomes a big nuisance and an expensive removal for a lot of people. And so making sure that you're responsible as a beekeeper and monitoring for swarming, and making sure that you've done everything you can to minimize that. And if a colony swarms, to capture that swarm, whether or not you have a personal use for it or not, there's always someone looking for a swarm of bees or looking for another colony. So if you didn't want it yourself, there's always someone who's very happy to get it if you didn't want it. Okay, next slide. Again, what happens if you don't collect the swarms? I found a couple of images here that I just thought were fantastic. So here's a heavy duty, tire where there must have been a hole or a puncture, and the bees decided, hey, we'll build our nest inside this tire. So that would be a difficult one to do the removal on, for sure. So I just thought that was a neat slide. Okay, one more, the next one. So here's what I'm talking about when they get into the wall of a building. If you're the homeowner in this particular situation, can you imagine the work involved in removing these bees and the expense involved? So when your bees swarm and you don't capture them, and they fly and find their new home in your next door neighbor's, soffit, or, in their brick wall, they can be quite upset, and it becomes quite a nuisance. And this is the type of thing I think that really helps lead to restrictions and laws keeping people from keeping honeybees in certain jurisdictions and in certain townships. Too many complaints about stuff like this will lead people to start making legislation keeping beekeeping into the more rural areas and not allowed in certain areas. Okay, next slide. Swarms can land anywhere. So, I've taken them off telephone poles and off the ground. I've never taken them off a human before, but you just have to be prepared for any situation. When a colony swarms, they go until the queen peters out and she lands on something, and the bees in her swarm follow and surround her. And sometimes it's really convenient and sometimes it's not. So you have to be prepared when you go on a swarm call for a lot of different potential situations, and it really causes you to have to think on your feet. Okay, next slide. Some tools that might make the job easier if you're going to capture swarms. One of my favorite tools, and it's in a picture coming up, is a 5-gallon bucket on an extendable pole. And so where I work, we have snow brooms, which is like a foam tool to use with a long handle to push snow off of cars. And there's basically a threaded spot in this piece of hard plastic that has the same threads for a long handle painter's pole. And so I bolted that to the bottom of a 5-gallon bucket, and I can extend this painter's pole out, let's say 15 feet, 20 feet high. And I have captured, dozens of swarms in this thing. It's been such a handy tool to have. I can fit it in the back of my truck. And if a swarm is 10 or 15 feet up high on a limb, I can get underneath it, bump it with the bottom of that, or, into that bucket, and then back up and dump these bees in front of a box that's sitting on the ground, and it works fantastic. Having a tarp or a blanket to put on the ground is very handy. Usually people don't think about this, but when you're a little bee and you're walking across your yard, it's like walking through the jungle. So if you have a tarp or a blanket that you can lay down, if you knock a swarm of bees off of a limb and they land on this tarp, it's a lot easier for you to see them and easier for them to move and get into the box that you're wanting to put them in. A ladder is always handy, obviously, depending on how high the swarm is. Obviously, safety needs to be a concern that you're always thinking about. You can't capture every swarm. I've had some that I just had to let go because, they were 50 feet up in the air and they were on a limb and I just couldn't get to them. Sometimes you have to let them go. Duct tape is very handy. A rope with a throwing weight, again, a handy tool. And then a pole saw or some loppers or pruning snips or shears. Those are fantastic, and they're handy depending on the situation of what you're trying to get. Most of the time when people call and say, I got a swarm of bees, if they land on a tree limb, if you said, hey, can I snip this limb here to make it easier? Most people are more than happy for you to cut whatever you got to cut to get those bees out of their yard. So having those tools in your vehicle makes it a lot easier. Okay, next slide, Michael. All right, so here was a swarm that I just liked this picture. This was a swarm that was in my yard, in my bee yard, and the way the sun was coming in the evening, I just thought it was a great picture because you can really see the speckle of bees all around. And on the lower left-hand side, you can see that 5-gallon bucket, and they're laying on a big old blanket, and the box is there, and the bees were slowly but surely figuring out where to go and get down into that box. But the goal is for you to get the bees in the box before they get away. All right, next slide. This is a picture of my father who is usually around and calls me when he sees swarms of bees. And so he sent me the picture on the right where there were 2 swarms that came out, and they landed, about 18 inches from each other, and were just about, chest high on a fruit tree that he had, or it might have been a pecan tree, I can't remember. But he said these, when they are that low and that easy to snip off and put into equipment, it sure makes it nice. But they're not always like that. All right, next slide. Here's one I captured, I think, a year ago or about that. This was, let's say 10 feet high, and they were all inside, as you can see, all the limbs and branches of this tree. I had to do this before work early one morning, and so sometimes I find that if you have comb works better than foundation, but foundation will also work. Having the frames and just pushing the frame and the foundation against the ball of bees there and holding it there for 15, 20 seconds, and then pulling it off easily, and then flipping it over and putting the other side of the nice wax smelling foundation against that. The bees will leave that and land and start crawling on that comb or on that foundation. And then you take that frame. I look on both sides. Do I see a queen? Do I see anything that looks like a queen? No. I put it into the box and grab the next frame. And until I do, you can also scoop, kind of use it as like a spatula, the frame, and kind of scoop the bees onto the frame of foundation, and then carefully put that into the box. And eventually, if all goes well, you'll get the queen inside that box. And once you get her in there, the bees will want to follow her and they'll want to be with her. And so if you can get the queen into your box and put the lid on, immediately the bees inside the box are going to come out to the front and they're going to fan that pheromone I talked about earlier. That is like a homing beacon to say, hey, here we are, the queen's in here, everybody else come on in. And very quickly, those bees will leave the trunk and those branches and go into that box. Okay, next slide, Michael. So here's a little better picture of that bucket, that the bucket and, the threaded part just unscrews from the painter's pole. And I know I've captured 30 swarms at least with that thing. And this was one that landed on a cedar tree. And if you've ever been around a cedar tree, you can't climb the inside of a cedar tree. It's way too dense. And so when it lands on the outside, about 15 feet high, you don't really have a lot of good options to get to it. And so this bucket was fantastic. I just scooped them up. I had my hive body laying on that blanket. And this is actually, I think, two different swarms in these two pictures here, but the principles are the same. I put a blanket down, I put the hive body on there, and I kind of gauge the distance that I need to put the box away from me so that whenever I have a pole that's extended, let's say 12 feet long, that I can bump the swarm and then back up and just kind of dump the bees right out in front. And in no time, they start going right in, and their behavior will quickly tell you whether or not you have the queen in there. If they start dissipating and start flying away and flying back up onto the limb, chances are you didn't get her. And so you need to let them settle down just a little bit and try it again. I've had some swarms that I've had to bump with that bucket 4 or 5 times, but eventually you get her. So the next slide. Here's one I got a call about on a big pole barn. The bees were in the gutter, just in the actual gutter, and a little more of a challenge to get out, but it was high enough that I was able to put this box with the frames right at the gutter, and I put a paint stick from one side of the gutter to the other side of the gutter so they could have a little bridge to crawl across to get to the box. And I left it there overnight. And the next morning, the picture on the right is the next morning. It cooled down enough and all the bees were inside that box. And I just climbed up the ladder, closed the entrance, took it down, put it in my truck, and drove it out to my bee yard and opened the entrance back up again. And that's where they stayed. So having tools available, and some on your feet thinking on how am I going to get these bees to go inside this box. Once you've done a couple, I tend to find that they go easier. So, okay, next slide. So this was a situation, where you don't have any equipment on you, having a big cardboard box in your vehicle that you could put a swarm into. I had to get a swarm one time off of a patio umbrella, and they were underneath, and a patio umbrella has all those little metal, supports that are going all around to support the umbrella. And so it was hard to get, the bees out from underneath that. And so I just took a cardboard box, cut a hole in it, the size of the metal stand for the umbrella, slid it up the cardboard box, up the shaft of the umbrella, and then just thumped it on the ground, and they all went into the cardboard box. So then you just lower the cardboard box, pull the umbrella out, and you've got all the bees in that cardboard box. And you dump them into an actual hive until they move in, and that's what I had to do to get them into that box. So you've got to be creative at times. I think that's all I wanted to say about that. All right, so your next, yeah. And so the other slide, it just said, don't leave them in there too long. So a cardboard box, a swarm is wanting to build. They're wanting to move into a new home, and they want to start building. And so if you leave a swarm inside of a cardboard box, even overnight, by the next day, they will have built a piece of comb as big as a baseball. So to me, I want all that work and all that effort to be put into building their comb on foundation or on frames. I hate to see it wasted. They build that, and then I got to go in there and cut it out or remove it, and all that work is wasted. So let's say you capture a swarm and it's in your box. What can you do to keep them there? Because once you provide them with a hive, that doesn't guarantee they're going to stay. You would think it would, because the bees are desperate and looking for a home, and you provide them with a fantastic home. And I've had many swarms that decided that nope, they're going to leave, and you go back out the next day and find that they're gone. And that's pretty discouraging, especially if you've spent several hours getting them into that box. So if you're able to add a frame of brood from another colony, that is a fantastic way to anchor that swarm into that box. Feeding 1-to-1 sugar syrup encourages comb building, and once the bees start building comb, usually they'll stay and remain in that box. What I like to do, and it sounds bad, but what I like to do is to use a screen like we're going to do with the nucleus colonies to lock the bees inside that deep box for at least a day. I'll put those bees in the shade somewhere where they're not going to get overheated, and that will allow them to start building their comb. And I've never had one leave that I've locked in there for a day, but I've had many leave that I did not lock in. And so I really have adopted that as a technique that I think is really beneficial to keeping that colony put and making them stay inside that box. The next slide, I think, will tell more about this, but if you make them think that it was their idea to enter, then research shows that the chances of them staying are also improved. Using previously used equipment or drawn comb helps. And I always tell people, you want to let the bees get into this box. So when you dump the swarm out, let the bees get into the box, but I don't like to leave that box sit there for an extended amount of time. Because when you think about it, a swarm lands on a limb, and they immediately send scout bees out to search for a new home. And it might take an hour, it might take 2 days for them to come to a consensus. That Honeybee Democracy book talks a lot about that. But those scout bees are looking for a new home, and I don't want to provide them a home only to have a scout bee return and to go into my box and say, hey, everybody, I found an awesome place that's about a half a mile to the west. Because then I'll come back out later and find that my swarm box is empty and all the bees have departed onto greener pastures. So I always say, once the hive is moved in, you're never going to get 100% of the bees in there. But once I'm confident and content with the amount of bees I have in that box, I close them up, put them in my truck, and I take off with them so that I'm moving that colony and the scout bees can't interfere. So I might put that swarm, around the corner of the house in the shade, but those scout bees can't do anything because I'm going to screen those bees into my box for a day. And by then they're going to start building. And then I don't have to really worry so much about that scout trying to discourage them or mislead them. So, all right, next slide, Michael. So I talked about that just briefly. Should you shake them in? Should you put them on the landing board and let them walk in by themselves? Whose idea was it to go into this box? Research shows that if you shake them in, that there's might be a little bit higher chance of them deciding to leave. Whereas if you let them walk in, and you see on the right, the picture where the bees were dumped out in front of the box and they're walking up like little soldiers up into that deep box, that will improve the chances of them staying put and staying in that box. So again, might be a small percentage of a chance that'll improve it, but I find that for me, screening them in for a day is the thing that to me has made the biggest impact on how often they stay and how often they leave. All right, one more slide, I think. Oh, so this is just something that, there's a lot, honeybees are pretty complicated animals. And one of the things that I've always been fascinated by is that you can have a colony, the parent colony, and the parent colony, the members of that colony know where home is at, right? They know that when they fly out looking for flowers and nectar and pollen, they know right where to come back. And if you move a colony, well, it messes them up and they got to figure out and reorient to where they were supposed to go. But if you have a colony that swarms, the members of that colony, they knew where home was at. And if they swarm and for some reason the queen does not fly out with them, they will sense that and return back to the parent colony, looking for the queen to say, hey, we all left and you didn't come with us. So, we're getting ready to leave. Can you come on, let's go. But if they do swarm and you capture them and put them into a box, you can put them right next to the parent colony that they swarmed from. And they're perfectly fine with that. From that point forward, their new home is right next door and they won't go into their parent colony. They keep using, and so it's like their brain has been wiped. So I always found it fascinating about at what point does that happen? Again, I don't have the answer to that. I just find it a fascinating, part of the mystery of beekeeping. Okay, and I think there's only one more, which is just, just another picture of a swarm that I caught, probably a couple of years ago. It's an amazing sight to behold to watch those bees start walking up into that box, and it's a great feeling to start up another colony, knowing that you caught them and that you can provide for them. So I think the last slide is just Q&A, or if we have any questions. I didn't look to see if we do. Looks like I see one question from Tim. If I spray Swarm Commander on the lid of an existing hive, will that suppress the colony's desire to swarm? I've never tried that, Tim. My thought is no. Swarm commander is an attractant for the honeybees, but if a colony is going to swarm, they're not going to be dissuaded from swarming because you've sprayed something under the lid. You know, they need, they're going to have already started raising queens, and the only thing that's going to stop that is by reducing the hive population or removing their ability to swarm, which is to remove the queen cells once you've confirmed that the queen is still present. So if you're unsure, it's important to do an inspection to find out if your queen is still present. If she's gone already, you don't want to remove all the queen cells, or otherwise the replacements that were intended to be raised for taking over that colony, you just removed them, you know, so you've put the colony in quite a predicament. So no, I don't think that it would have any bearing whatsoever on a colony wanting to swarm. And let's see, let me close this, and if I can figure out where my chat is, let's see here. Here we go. Okay. So let me see here. So some people have got questions in the chat. Is this being taped where we can watch it later? Yes, I believe Michael is taping it. I just wanted to take a second to thank Michael Godfrey for again hosting these webinars and these meetings. You know, he puts a lot of work into getting these things organized, and I couldn't do it without him, so I appreciate all his work. Yes, I believe that this will be recorded and at some point uploaded to the YouTube channel for the Eastern Missouri Beekeeping Association. I don't have a timeline on that. Right now, the club is kind of being ran on a limited number of people who are volunteering their time. And so a lot of us are beekeepers, not a lot of us are technical whizzes when it comes to uploading, you know, videos and editing things. And so I'm not sure when that's going to happen, but I believe that that is the plan. Is the rocks around the beehive recommended as in this photo? So there was a picture of I believe a bee yard that had some gravel down there, and that isn't, I wouldn't say it's recommended. Will it work? Sure. But you definitely don't need that. I mean, none of my bees have gravel around them. Mine are in yards that have on hive stands, usually 2 hives to a stand, or on a pallet, you know, something like that. But you definitely don't need gravel. You just need a level place with no tripping hazards and room for you to work around the back and the sides of the colony, which is where you'll be most of the time. Rarely am I ever out in front of a colony, because a colony needs to fly, and that's the, you know, that's the runway for the colony. So I don't walk out in front of the colony very often. And so the third part of this question, do they swarm far or in the neighboring trees? And usually a colony will swarm, and when it lands, it will be within sight of the parent colony. I've had some that have swarmed, you know, 10 feet away, some that have swarmed 50 feet away, but usually in that kind of ballpark, which is why I often find it funny when someone will say, I found a swarm in my bee yard, but they're not my bees. And I'll ask them, well, what makes you say that? And it's like, well, I don't think my hives have swarmed. And I always tell them, if you found them in your bee yard, I would say that the chances are very, very high that it's a swarm from your hive. You better go in and do an inspection, because, you know, you probably have a hive that's swarmed. All right, let's see here. Oh, thank you, Mary, for the compliment. And oh, thank you again from Steve. Thank you, Steve. And thanks again to Michael for his work on the organizing all this. And we still have 35 people with us. So just as a way of review for everyone who someone may have missed the beginning of the talk, queen delivery, April 16th, this coming Saturday, 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. at the Danforth Plant Science Center parking lot on Olive. There are volunteers that are needed if you want to show up to volunteer to help hand out queens. We would appreciate the assistance. You might want to be there about 30 minutes early, so about 8:30. If you are arriving to get queens, make sure that you have your receipt. Make sure that you bring, a sign, a piece of paper, or something that has your name and how many queens you're expecting to get, and have that listed. I would recommend you bring a box to put your queens in. The other announcement, nuke delivery, looks like it's fairly firmed up here. April 23rd, same location, the Donald Danforth Plant Science Center on Olive. Volunteers are asked to be there at 5 a.m. Pickup for nucleus colonies is going to be 6:30 to 8 a.m. on the 23rd of April. So if you have any questions, please feel free to send me an email on the screen that's on the slide that's up, or you can send an email to info@easternmobeekeepers.com. That's my cell phone. You could also, give me a call or send me a text, and I'll try to answer whatever I can. So if that's all there is, I see it's about 1 minute till 9. So we're ending this on a pretty good time here. So I appreciate everyone's tuning in, and thank you again to Steve and to Michael for their assistance here. And I will see everybody next time. Thanks again.
Thanks, John.
Thanks, Michael.
Have a good one.
You too. You guys take care.
Bye. See you
Bye.
Saturday.
All right. Sounds good.
Bye.
Bye.